Hello everybody, this is Dave Bredhauer from Memory Box. Today's video is going to feature the Birthday Rose Clear Stamp Set. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'll be using this stamp set to create two very different cards. One, colored pencil on dark cardstock, one of my favorite techniques, and the other, watercolor. And it has such a different look from the colored pencil that I wanted to share both in one video so you guys could get a feel for how versatile this image is. There's lots of open areas for coloring, so it's ideal for colored pencil or watercolor. And by watching the video, you can figure out which technique is best for you. So let's get started. This is colored pencil on dark cardstock. I love the look of colored pencil on a darker shade of cardstock. All the little texture that shows through once you color, it's just really nice. And when you use wax-based colored pencils, like the Prismacolor pencils I'm going to be using in the video, then they pop right on top of that dark cardstock and really make things come to life. I've stamped this with VersaFine ink. You can use any black ink to stamp this with. You just have to make sure that you're using an ink that won't smudge and something that you can see, so you can see the shapes that you need to fill in as you do the color pencil coloring. So my process here is pretty simple. I'm identifying each little shape here. These are individual petals in the rose, and I'm shading them in a little bit at a time, trying to use some tight little circles to shade things in. So what I'll do is I'll draw sort of a harsh line right along the edge of a petal, and then I'll switch to these circular little strokes to sort of shade things out. And I lighten up on the pressure as I do that. Now, I'm not consistent every time. Sometimes I press a little bit harder, sometimes I press a little bit softer. Just kind of depends, how I'm feeling as I'm coloring this in. The idea here is to build up layers of color. So I'll put the red down, and then I'm going to put some pink down now, just to kind of fill things in and add a little bit more color to each petal. And you can see that I go over some of that original color, the original red, and then shade a little bit further into the petal with the pink. At this point, things don't really come together. You have to plan on these things sort of layering up and building as you go. And I'll continue to add different sorts of colors on the petals and different areas. Now I'm putting a little bit of orange on there just to kind of accentuate one end of the petal with a different color than maybe the petal next to it. This is just going to add a lot of texture and a lot of vibrancy to the final product. Again, I don't have an exact plan here. I guess in general, I'm trying to put some darker color towards the base of the petals and then a little bit lighter color at the tips of the petals, but I kind of switch that up a little bit. I think the more you blend and the more you layer, it adds a lot of movement of color to the design, and it ends up turning out just amazing in the end. I think the layering is really the key. I'm adding a few highlights in and then going back over that with the red, and what that does is brighten the red because there's some lighter color underneath it. Okay, we're going to move on to the leaves here. I've put a really bright teal down to start filling in these leaves, and you'll notice with the Prismacolor pencils that some of these colors pop a little bit more than others. This particular teal is called aquamarine, and I'm shading over it with chartreuse. This combination is super vibrant and really shows up when you're doing this on a darker cardstock. You can see that they blend nicely together and they're just so vibrant. You'll find combinations of colors and specific shades that tend to show up a little bit better than others. White, of course, shows up, and this hot pink is a favorite as well. Oh, and don't forget that Imperial Violet. That is a really deep purple color that shows up great on dark cardstock. I'm using it on the berries there, and wow, it really shows up. It's almost like paint. Now other colors, like this yellow, you can see I made some lines with the yellow. They tend to be a little weak on the darker cardstock, but don't worry, it still shows up a little bit. It's subtle, but you'll see it when you see these in person. It's a little bit difficult for you to see how these show up in the video, but once you do it in person, you'll see that these little glints and gleams of yellow and different shades have sort of a luster to them with these wax-based pencils. Oh, now there's lots of different wax-based pencils out there, lots of different brands. I encourage you to try all of them. Whatever you have in your collection is totally fine. I think that some are just going to show up a little bit better than others, and it's just going to be something that you'll probably have to experiment with to adjust to your level expectations. I love Prismacolor pencils. A million years ago, I used to pack up the kids and the dogs, and my wife and I would drive around the United States to all the stamp stores that we sold to, and I'd teach Prismacolor classes, and I was lucky to get to know lots of customers and crafters out there, and it was just such a special and wonderful time in my life. And these colored pencil classes, once we got going, you could just hear a pin drop when we were doing the projects. Everyone got really into it. It was a very therapeutic, almost meditative thing as you're blending and coloring and making all your little circles onto the cards and projects that we were working on. And it still continues to be something that's really wonderful for me to do, to unwind and just kind of fill up some space and kind of free my mind up for other things. I love color penciling. And I think maybe one of the most important parts about color penciling is the amount of control that you have. There isn't something running or drying or not drying. Color pencil is very easy to control. You're coloring, you can stop and go do something else, and it's not blending or bleeding or running. And you can come back to it and just pick up where you left off. And so this has always been a really satisfying way for me to make a card. And I usually have some colored pencils handy when I'm not doing anything and thinking maybe I'll just craft for a little bit. They're just one of my favorite things to do. Now, I'm not going to do anything too advanced for this color pencil video. I think mainly I just wanted you to see how vibrant and amazing this can look on a dark cardstock. I'm going to add a few accent marks here. You can see that that light colored pencil shows up even on that colored area. Just as nice little detail there. I'm just putting a little bit of ridges on the petals, just here and there, just to add some highlights. There's lots of things you can do with colored pencil, but I wanted to keep it sort of basic today, just so you can see the process. Now, I've finished adding the colored pencil to the image, and it's pretty much all filled in. I'm going to go ahead and put it back in my positioner. My stamp is still in its original position, and I'm going to ink it up with some Versamark ink, just a clear, sticky ink. And since it's in the original position when I first stamped it, it's going to stamp right on top of that original design, and I'm going to emboss it with some white embossing powder. And what that'll do is add outlines to the design. And the effect of having those color pencil strokes and texture surrounded by that bright white embossing powder is so cool. You can see it really makes that color pop even more on that dark surface. And you still get that look of colored pencil where the texture, or the tooth is what they call it, of the paper shows through a little bit with all that waxy colors sort of sitting on top. Such a cool look. Okay, so now we're going to try a different technique with this same image. Again, we're using the watercolor rose, and I've embossed this on watercolor paper with white embossing powder. Now this is 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. It's got a little bit of a texture to it, a little nubbly texture. And I've embossed it with plain old white embossing powder and then just taped it down to my work surface. I'm going to go ahead and start filling in some of the rose image here so you can kind of see what's going on. So the paint on my brush is really watery. I've chosen sort of a yellow ochre color to fill this rose image in, and you can see the definition of the outlines from the embossing powder. And then I'm going to go back in with an accent color. So just a really, really soft pink. Lots of water, so it's really pale, just barely adding any to the rose. And mainly I'm staying at the base of each petal and letting that paint do the work for me. You can see it migrates towards the ends of the petals. It sort of spreads out and feathers. So I'm letting that wet surface sort of move things along for me. And you can see in the video that some of the areas are wetter than others. If it's not moving, then it tends to be a little dry there. You might need to go back in and sort of touch it up there to pull things along so you don't get too harsh a line. Now, this is the first layer, so don't get too worried about things. You're going to be building up lots of layers here to really get that color saturated on the rose. I sometimes find that I just don't put enough paint down when I'm watercoloring. I just stay really pale. It's one of those things where I don't want to overdo it because it's always easier to add more, but it's harder to take things away. But anyways, you want to build up lots and lots of color. So you can see I'm just sort of being careful, but adding a little bit more each time. This color is a little bit stronger than that first layer that I did. There's a little bit more paint in the mixture and a little less water. So it tends to be a little bit stronger once you get it down on the paper. And you can see how that pink and that yellow is starting to sort of meld together. As I add another layer, you can see if that petal is wet, it's going to migrate out on its own. And that's a good thing. You want that paint to kind of do the work for you. Okay, so let's see what it looks like now that it's dry. I've let everything dry and it's given me time to evaluate what needs a little bit more color. So there's a lot of yellow still showing on these roses, and I just want to sort of warm things up with a little bit more peachy pink tone. So I'm going to go back in. I'm not putting tons of paint down. I'm just kind of focusing towards the base of each petal and adding some here and there, just where I think I want a little bit more of that peachy pink color. And notice there is going to be sort of a harsh line if I don't go back and fix that. So I'm working sort of quickly. I'm putting the paint down, I'm adding it to all the spots that I think that I want to get to. And you just have to plan on getting to all the different petals that are on that rose. And there's a lot of them, so make sure you hit all of them. You have plenty of time. We're just going to keep adding a little bit to the base of each petal as we go. Then go back and clean it up with a clean, damp brush. You'll have a little bit of paint, so just kind of move that onto another petal. But then clean off your brush and pull around the edge of those harsh lines just to soften them up a little bit. I don't want to completely cover up that yellow. I want a little bit of that to show through for highlights, but I do want to soften the edge of those pinky peach tones. I'm going to move on to the other rose, and I'm putting strong color in the middle. That's where all the shadows are on that flower. That's where things are sort of folded in and there's not as much light. So I'm focusing the color a little bit more towards the center and also again at the base of each petal. I'll put some on, making sure that each petal has a little bit of attention to it, and I'm adding some color as I go, strengthening it. And I might just drag a little bit off if it seems like it's a little too wet, just to kind of soften things, and go around those edges just to soften them up. Again, avoid some of that yellow so that you can have a little bit of highlight at the tip. Now, while that second rose is sort of melding, I'm going to go back and work on the first rose. Just add a little bit more color at the bases of the petals and maybe a little bit more in the center just to kind of build up some color so that there's some depth in the center. You can see that adding the color adds yet another layer and makes this a little more spectacular. It's getting close. Things are starting to come together where there's some yellow at the tips and then some darker color as you get towards the base of the petals. While that's sitting, you can go back and work on your second rose again. It's just going to be a dance as you go back and work from one part of the project to another part of the project. You have to kind of plan this out a little bit with watercolor because if things get too wet, then things blend too much. So you have to give it time to rest just a little bit so that you don't overblend it. Everything starts looking pretty much the same. So the leaves are completely isolated from the roses, so I don't need to worry too much about the greens blending into the pinks. I'm going to go ahead and put some light green down And then I'll go back in with a darker green, and since that is wet inside those leaves, it's going to start to blend for me. I'm not going to pay too much attention to where the shadows and where the depth is. I'm just going to add some paint. The idea is to make layers here. Layers are what makes the eye just mesmerized with watercolor. So I'm going to plan on putting lots of different colors on each little green, and as they blend together, they'll create even more colors. Oh, and if you get a little bit of green into that rose, quick, get a paper towel and just soak it up and you'll be good. If you let this paint sit too long, it tends to stain the paper and it's a little bit harder to get up. But I've had really good luck removing paint from areas that I didn't want it to be. You just have to work quickly. You might need to add a little water and work it with a clean brush and just keep dabbing it with a paper towel. That'll generally remove everything. And then if you end up painting over it, since these are layers, it just kind of adds to the whole color mystery that you're making on the project. So it sometimes ends up being a happy mistake. Okay, I'm going to keep filling in the green leaves over here. You can see there's lots of different shades of blue and green as we're filling in those leaves. And I think that just makes it more interesting. There is a little less control here than in colored pencil. You'll notice that things are wet and maybe you have to quickly add some more color for that blending to happen, or maybe something's running. So it requires a little bit more planning than the colored pencil does, but there's nothing like the look of watercolor. It's free form, you sort of embrace how things move, and this is something that I never tire of. I think that I have to get in a certain mindset for watercolor because you have to sort of be ready for some action and to be able to move. But if you think of it in terms of a layered process, it sort of takes the pressure off. You can paint something out, let it dry, come back later and add another layer. So that usually makes people feel a little bit more comfortable about doing watercolor. Okay, so we're going to prepare the roses again for yet another layer. At this point, those roses are bone dry. They're just way too dry to do any blending on top of. So I'm just adding some clear, plain water on top of these roses. I'm keeping a clean brush and adding it to make it a wet surface. And I'll go back in with a very small brush and start adding some more pink in there. Again, trying to stay towards the little nooks and the bottoms of each petal. And you can see, since it's wet, it wants to migrate out and fill the petal in. You want to make sure that that petal is nice and wet, because as that spreads out, it blends and creates little rivulets of color. It's just so wonderful to watch as that fills in. So you want to make sure things are nice and wet, and that will do most of the work for you. And you can see how deep this color is starting to get just because we've added several layers of watercolor on there, and each layer is building on the last and sort of blending into the one before it until your eye can't really tell where one color stops and the next one starts. I'm leaving a little bit of that original yellowy gold color here and there because I like the texture. I want that to still show through because it's got some highlight to it and it's a different color, and it makes you kind of think, well, how did that happen? There's still some yellow on that petal, but here's a beautiful blended peachy pink also on the petal, and everything's sort of moving together, and this is what's so dazzling about using the watercolor technique. Once you've got those centers kind of filled in a little bit more, because you want those to be a little bit deeper, you can go back and add some accent color to some of the other areas around the image. Those purple flowers at the top were a little weak, so I wanted to add a little bit more color to them just to make them stand out and compete with those roses a little bit more. I add some water, add a little paint, keep on layering, knowing that I'm going to build that up as I go, and the color's going to get stronger and stronger. And now you'll notice that those leaves are pretty dry. You can go ahead and accent them with a different shade of green. All these different shades of green, from blue to yellow green, work together to create the whole composition. you'll notice that some leaves have a lot of blue on them, and then some leaves are just sort of a yellowy green. I don't want you to look at every individual leaf. I want you to look at the whole project holistically, that all of this needs to come together. There's this sort of bright color in the middle. There's some cool colors of leaves kind of fading into the background. Some little bright spots of purple here and there. See what you can do to balance things out. There's no particular rule here. The idea is to have fun. So once everything is dry, you can go ahead and use your matching die to cut this out and create a glorious birthday card. Look at the texture on here. Look how things have blended together. All those different shades compile to layer together and make lots of movement and so many colors. Okay, crafters, thanks so much for stopping by. I hope you have a favorite. Is it watercolor or colored pencil?